Right. Well, I'm out and about again, but as I've been driving around a lot lately, it's given me some time to think through some things. And I've been thinking about the quadriga. If you uh, ever study the history of exegesis or anything like that, you run into uh, the medieval way of reading called the quadriga, and it's the fourfold interpretation. Um, I believe it's Latin for something like a four-horse chariot, something like that. Um, and uh, Usually, as Protestants, as moderns, really, we look at the quadriga and we kind of roll our eyes because of some of the silly ways it's been used. But as I've been thinking about it, I was uh, realizing, but it is just sort of the four ways that we do read or interpret things, and we do it all the time. What the medievals were really good at was systematizing things like this. They would systematize and say, okay, well, there's really four ways that you can read a passage, and by systematizing it, it makes it possible to say, which one am I doing? Is this the right way to read this particular passage? Am I reading it properly? What we do is we say, oh, uh, well, the four ways of reading are literal, allegorical, or you might call typological, moral, and anagogical, which is more like what we think of when we say allegory, right? So when they said allegory, they were looking for really for typology most of the time. When we say, but when they said anagogical, it was really what we think of as allegory. And those four ways of reading um, are just the ways that we approach particular texts or apply particular texts. And how it worked was they had the literal meaning or the historical meaning, what the text says happened, that sort of thing. The allegorical reading, how the text points to Christ or to different doctrinal truths. When you read the Old Testament, they expected to find Christ everywhere, and then the moral, how it teaches us to live the right life. What does the good life look like? How to deal with particular situations well, how to live a moral life. And the anagogical, and this is where it's kind of the allegorical interpretation, the way we use the word. How does the text point to uh, realities beyond itself? Uh, how does so? How I would if we were reading the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis, uh, you uh, you have historically he was sold into slavery by his brothers. He went down he went down underground into the well. Then he went down underground into prison, and then he went down underground into a deeper prison, and then he came out the other side by interpreting dreams. He came out and ends up second in line in charge of the whole Egyptian empire, and rescues the empire from a famine. Right, that's the historical interpretation. If we were going to say, well, how does this text point to Christ, the typological interpretation, you would say, well, Jesus's life takes on the same sort of shape. He is denied by all of the people around him. He goes to the cross. He goes underground. He goes into the prison of Sheol, the prison of the grave, the prison of the tomb. But then he comes out and is made King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and he begins rescuing the world from its famine. So you say that you can see how um, the text is pointing forward to Christ. Morally, you would say, well, hey, don't be like Joseph's brothers. They got jealous. They they saw the new leader as a threat. When you get a new boss at work, don't get jealous. Or Or, hey, when you go through something difficult, know that God has something good for you. God is preparing you for something. So you can have faith, you can pray, you can turn to the Lord, even in the deepest pit. And then anagogical, you would be, something along the lines of, and this one's harder for us in the modern world because we don't have as many categories or as deep of a knowledge often. But you would say something like, uh, the uh, the 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 rescuing from famine at the end of the world, when the church spreads throughout the world. It's spreading the kingdom of Joseph, and the kingdom of Joseph has it takes away all the different kinds of famines, the famine of ignorance, because it starts schools, the church starts hospitals, and it's an extension of Christ's rule. So it's the famine of health. It brings healing where it goes. It teaches people, it rescues people from idolatry, and idolatry is expensive, so it takes away poverty, right? Um, we and we read passages, and most of the time with anagogical, it's more along the lines of, this situation I'm in, I can see how it's like this story from the Old Testament, right? And then you have uh, moral moral questions that sometimes the story answers, but also just what character am I in this story? When somebody's being attacked unjustly, they could say, "Well, I'm like Joseph," right? And that's in this situation, and that's an anagogical interpretation because uh, God God brings righteousness to the unjust, and that's an eternal truth that God loves justice, and so He brings justice into the world. That eternal truth is something that we see in the story that then applies to us in our lives. And we read all sorts of things like this. In fact, not just the Bible, right? We cast ourselves into stories all the time. When young kids are dealing with bullies, they take comfort in stories like Harry Potter and Draco Malfoy, and those sorts of stories. They take comfort in those stories. They cast themselves into those stories with their imagination in order to understand their own life, right? And that's how an anagogical reading works. And what's helpful about the systematization is, when you're reading a passage in the Bible, you can say, oh, here's a thought about this passage, and you go, oh, well, that's an anagogical thought. That's not the foundation of anything. I have to do exegesis about the historical before I can make any sort of applicational interpretation. It helps you not just jump to application immediately, but lay the proper foundation of a literal reading of the text and a typological reading of the text. How does how does this passage how is this passage what does that tell us about history and truth and what has happened, but also what does this tell us about Christ, right? And then you've laid this foundation, you see Christ in the text, and then you can move to a moral interpretation. Well, how do I then act if this is true, right? It's a way of building truth to ethics, and then also building truth to how does my life, how do I live out the truths of this text? Which character am I in this story? That those sorts of questions, they have to be laid on the foundation of the historical. So what's helpful about the Quadriga is by systematizing it, it it helps in when we think that way, it helps us to make sure that we're building on the actual solid interpretations, understanding before we move to the application. So yeah, just something that I was thinking about while uh, working through some medieval texts recently.